The lamplight flickered across bloodied tweezers. In the small cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, Ruth Palmer's steady hands worked over a man's skull, extracting something that had lived there for 18 years, something that had stolen his hearing, his voice, his hope. They say the devil hides in small places. Ruth had never believed that, not until the night she pulled one from a man's ear and heard him speak for the first time since he was 19 years old. But that moment, that impossible miracle, came at the end of a journey that began 3 weeks earlier with a choice between two hells. 3 weeks earlier, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, November 1884. The courtroom smelled of tobacco and old wood. Ruth Palmer sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the weight of 260 pounds pressing into the hard wooden bench. She had learned long ago not to slouch. Slouching made people think you were ashamed, and Ruth Palmer had done nothing to be ashamed of. Judge Henry Carver looked down at her from his bench, his weathered face grave. He was a fair man, Ruth knew, as fair as the law allowed, but fairness and justice were not always the same thing. "Mrs. Palmer," he said, and his voice carried through the silent room, "this court has reviewed the petition filed by Mr. Thomas Garrett regarding the death of his wife, Sarah Garrett, on September 15th of this year. The petition claims negligence on your part as the attending midwife." Ruth kept her face still. She had attended Sarah Garrett's birth. She had watched Sarah bleed out on her own bed while her husband paced the hallway, drunk on whiskey and rage. She had tried everything she knew, every technique she had learned from her mother and from the medical texts she had studied in secret. But Sarah had died anyway, and the baby with her. However, Judge Carver continued, this court is also aware of certain irregularities in this case. In the back of the courtroom, Reverend Joseph Kern shifted in his seat. Ruth could feel his eyes on her back, cold and judgmental. The Reverend had been the one to start the rumors, the one to whisper in Thomas Garrett's ear that a woman Ruth's size had no business practicing medicine, that her very presence was an affront to God's natural order. Given the complexity of this matter, the judge said, and the lack of definitive evidence of negligence, this court is prepared to offer an alternative to the asylum commitment Mr. Garrett has requested. Ruth's heart hammered. The asylum. The Territorial Women's Asylum in Helena, where women who were inconvenient, difficult, or simply unwanted were sent to disappear. Where fat women like Ruth were put on starvation rations and forced into hard labor until they either conformed or died. "You have 72 hours to enter into a legal marriage," Judge Carver said. "Should you do so, and should your husband be willing to assume responsibility for your welfare, this court will dismiss the petition and close this matter." Ruth stared at him. Marriage. To whom? She was 28 years old, widowed for 2 years, and considered unmarriageable by every standard that mattered in Bitterroot Valley. Her first husband had married her for the land she inherited. He had died of pneumonia without ever once looking at her with anything resembling affection. "The court has already identified a suitable candidate," the judge continued. "Mr. Silas Worth has agreed to the arrangement." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Ruth turned, searching the faces behind her. Silas Worth. She knew the name. Everyone in Bitterroot Valley knew the name. The mountain man who lived 15 miles outside town. The deaf recluse whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago. The man the Reverend had called cursed, whose very presence in town made people nervous. He stood near the back, tall, and weathered, his face expressionless. He wore a clean but worn suit that looked uncomfortable on his lean frame. His dark eyes met hers for just a moment before sliding away. "Do you accept these terms, Mrs. Palmer?" Judge Carver asked. Ruth looked at the judge, then at Reverend Kern, who was watching with barely concealed satisfaction, then at Silas Worth, who stood perfectly still waiting. The asylum or the mountain, slow death or unknown fate. "I accept," Ruth said. Done. The ceremony took place that afternoon in the same courtroom. No flowers, no guests except the required witnesses. No pretense that this was anything but a legal transaction. Reverend Kern was conspicuously absent. Judge Carver performed the ceremony himself, reading the words quickly and without flourish. Ruth repeated her vows in a voice that did not shake. Silas Worth said nothing. He simply nodded when prompted, his jaw tight. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Carver said. Silas hesitated. For a long moment Ruth thought he might refuse. Then he leaned down and brushed his lips against her cheek. Quick, perfunctory, cold. "Congratulations," the judge said, though his tone suggested condolences might be more appropriate. As they left the courthouse, Thomas Garrett stood on the steps, his face red with drink and fury. "This isn't over," he said to Ruth. "You killed my wife. You'll answer for it." Silas stepped between them. He did not speak, did not need to. His size and stillness were enough. Thomas Garrett backed away muttering. Ruth followed her new husband to a wagon loaded with her few possessions. He helped her up onto the seat without meeting her eyes, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode out of Bitterroot Valley in silence. The journey took 4 hours through falling snow. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, away from the valley, away from civilization. Ruth watched the landscape change. Pine forests closed in around them. The air grew colder, thinner. Silas Worth drove with steady competence, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Ruth studied him when she thought he was not looking. His face was weathered from years outdoors, carved into harsh lines by weather and solitude. His hands on the reins were scarred and strong. Every 45 seconds or so, his jaw would clench a small spasm of tension that came and went like clockwork. She tried speaking to him once, asking about the route. He did not respond, did not even turn his head. Deaf, she reminded herself. He cannot hear you. But she noticed something strange. When the horse stumbled slightly on a patch of ice, Silas corrected immediately, as though he had felt the shift through the reins before it happened. When a branch cracked in the forest to their left, he did not react at all. But when the wagon wheel hit a rut, he steadied the load before Ruth even felt the jolt. Deaf to sound, she thought, but not to vibration, not to the physical world. The cabin appeared as the sun began to set behind the mountains. It was larger than Ruth had expected, sturdy log construction with a stone chimney, glass windows which meant money or skill or both. A barn and corral sat to one side, sheltered by pines. Isolated, utterly isolated, no other cabins visible, no smoke from neighboring chimneys, just trees and mountains and sky. Silas stopped the wagon and climbed down. He extended a hand to help Ruth. She took it, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, and stepped down into the snow. He led her inside without ceremony. The cabin was neat, almost austere, one main room with a stone fireplace already laid with wood, a table and 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 doors on opposite walls, both closed. Silas set her trunk down by the door. Then he pulled a small slate and piece of chalk from his pocket and wrote in careful letters, "You can have the west room. I will sleep out here." Ruth read the words, then looked up at him. "That is not necessary," she said, though she knew he could not hear. He shook his head and wrote again. "It is already arranged." She wanted to argue, wanted to say something about dignity, about not being a burden, but the truth was she was relieved. The idea of sharing a bed with this stranger made her stomach twist. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Silas nodded once, then turned and began building up the fire. Ruth picked up her trunk and carried it into the west room. It was small, but clean. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single window looking out onto the darkening forest, and on the small table beside the bed, 3 books. She picked up the first one, Gray's Anatomy, a medical text, expensive, well-worn. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the book in her hands. A deaf mountain man with medical texts. A man who had agreed to marry a stranger to save her from the asylum. She did not understand. But for the first time since Sarah Garrett's death, she felt something other than despair. She felt curious. Ruth woke to darkness and sound. Not sound exactly. Impact. A heavy thump from the main room like a body hitting the floor. She sat up, heart pounding, and fumbled for matches. Her hands shook as she lit the small oil lamp on the bedside table. The flame caught, pushed back the darkness. Another sound. A groan, low and animal and full of pain. Ruth threw back the quilt and grabbed her robe. She opened the door. Silas Worth lay on the floor near the fireplace, convulsing. One hand clawed at the right side of his head. His face was twisted in agony, pale and slick with sweat. The slate lay beside him, chalk scattered across the floor. Ruth's medical training overrode her shock. She crossed the room quickly and knelt beside him. "Silas," she said, knowing he could not hear, but unable to stop herself. "Silas, look at me." His eyes opened, dark and desperate and filled with suffering so profound it made her breath catch. She grabbed his wrist, checked his pulse, rapid and thready. Not good. She leaned close, examining his face in the firelight. His right pupil was dilated larger than the left. Cranial pressure. Dangerous. Ruth's mind raced through possibilities. Stroke, tumor, infection, injury. Her eyes fell on his right ear. In the lamplight she could see something. A faint darkness deep in the canal, and worse, a thin trickle of blood seeping out. She grabbed the lamp and held it close, angling the light. The ear canal was inflamed, swollen, and deep inside, barely visible, something moved. Ruth's stomach turned, but she did not look away. She grabbed the slate, wrote quickly. "Something alive in your ear. Let me extract it." Silas stared at the words, then at her. For several long seconds he did not respond. The convulsions had stopped, leaving him trembling and exhausted. But his eyes were clear enough to understand what she was asking. Finally, slowly, he nodded. Ruth stood. Her hands were steady now. She had delivered 23 babies. She had set broken bones and lanced infections and sutured wounds. She had watched Sarah Garrett die and had been unable to save her. But this she could do. She moved to the kitchen, built up the fire in the stove, set a pot of water to boil. While it heated, she gathered supplies. Clean cloth. Whiskey from the shelf. The small sewing kit from her trunk, which contained fine tweezers she had used to remove splinters and glass shards. She sterilized the tweezers in the boiling water, then held them over the flame. The metal glowed faintly, then cooled. Silas had managed to drag himself to the table. He sat slumped in the chair, head in his hands, breathing hard. Ruth brought the lamp close and positioned it on the table. She poured a small amount of olive oil into a bowl, warmed it slightly, then drew it up into a clean eyedropper. She touched Silas's shoulder. He looked up. She pointed to the table, mimed lying down with his head turned. He understood. He stretched out on the table on his side, his right ear facing up. Ruth positioned the lamp as close as she dared. "This is going to hurt," she said, even though he could not hear. The words were for herself, a reminder of what she was about to do. She dripped the warm oil into his ear canal. 1 drop, 2, 3. The oil would loosen debris, encourage anything living inside to move toward the opening. They waited. 5 minutes that felt like hours. Ruth kept her hand on Silas's shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles, the trembling that ran through him. Then she saw it, a segmented body emerging from the canal, dark and glistening in the lamplight. She picked up the tweezers. Her hand did not shake. The first attempt failed. The creature pulled back deeper into the canal. Silas made a choked sound. Ruth adjusted her grip, used the curved forceps instead, the ones designed for grasping. She could see the thorax now, the way the segments connected. She got purchase on the body just behind what she thought might be the head, held firm, and pulled, slowly, carefully, steadily. Silas's hands clenched on the table edge, hard enough that his knuckles went white. Blood seeped from beneath his fingernails. But he did not move his head. The creature came free all at once. A beetle larva 2 inches long, blood slicked and writhing. Segmented legs clawed at the air. Ruth dropped it into a jar of whiskey she had prepared. The larva thrashed once, twice, then went still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Silas sat up. He stared at the jar, at the thing floating in the amber liquid. His hand rose slowly to his ear, touching the spot where for 18 years something had lived and fed and stolen his hearing. Ruth waited. She did not know what to say, did not know if there were words for this. Silas opened his mouth. The sound that came out was rough, unpracticed, the vocal cords of a man who had not spoken in nearly 2 decades. "I can hear you." 3 words. Simple. Devastating. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since their wedding, something in his face cracked open. Not relief. Something deeper. Something that looked like grief for all the years he had lost. "Your heartbeat," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I can hear your heartbeat." They sat at the kitchen table in the hours before dawn. Neither spoke. Ruth's hands shook with delayed shock. Silas stared at the jar containing the beetle larva, his expression unreadable. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. The cabin creaked and settled. These were the only sounds, and they were enough. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "How long?" she asked. Silas did not answer at first. He was looking at his hands, at the blood beneath his nails from where he had gripped the table. When he spoke, his voice was rough, the words coming slowly as though he was remembering how to shape them. 18 years since the mine collapsed." Ruth waited. "I was 19, Silas continued, "working the silver mine up Garnet Ridge. There was a dynamite blast. Something went wrong. The tunnel came down. I was buried under rock and timber for 3 hours before they dug me out." He paused, swallowed, continued. "I was unconscious for 2 days after. When I woke up, the hearing was gone. Doctors said it was concussive deafness, damage from the blast, nothing to be done." "But it was not," Ruth said. "No." His voice hardened. "The pain started 6 months later. Headaches, pressure. Feels like something was eating through my skull. I went to 7 doctors over the years. They all said the same thing, psychological, trauma from the accident. I was imagining it." Ruth felt anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp. "They did not even look," she said. "Why would they?" Silas met her eyes. "I was a deaf mine worker, not worth the time, not worth believing." Ruth thought of Sarah Garrett, of the way the Reverend had dismissed her findings, her concerns, her professional judgment, of being called incompetent, negligent, dangerous, of being blamed for a death she could not have prevented. She understood. "Why did you agree to marry me?" she asked. "You could have hired any healer. You did not need a wife." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate. "Because Reverend Kern announced from the pulpit that you killed Sarah Garrett through incompetence. Because he said a woman your size had no business pretending to practice medicine." He looked at her directly. "I have spent 18 years being told my pain is not real. I know what it feels like when people decide you do not matter, when they look at you and see only what is wrong, not what is true." He reached for the slate, wrote slowly, "I thought maybe you would listen, instead of just looking and seeing broken." Ruth read the words, understood what he was saying, what he was not saying. This man had married her not despite her weight, not despite the scandal, not despite anything. He had married her because he understood what it meant to be dismissed, to be invisible, to have your suffering ignored because you did not fit the shape of what people wanted to see. "I listened," she said quietly. "I believed you, and I was right to." Silas smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and unpracticed, but it was real. "Yes," he said, "you were." They sat in silence again, but this time it was different, comfortable. The silence of 2 people who had found something unexpected, understanding. Ruth woke late the next morning to the smell of coffee. She dressed quickly and emerged from the west room to find Silas at the stove cooking eggs and bacon with careful concentration. He heard her footsteps, actually heard them. He turned, and the wonder on his face was like watching a child discover something magical. "Good morning," he said. His voice was stronger already, still rough but clearer. "Good morning," Ruth replied. She sat at the table feeling strange. This was the first real conversation they had ever had. The first time they had existed in the same space as equals rather than strangers bound by legal necessity. Silas brought her coffee, then returned to the stove. He moved carefully, testing his new reality. Every sound seemed to startle him slightly. The sizzle of bacon, the clink of the fork against the pan, the scrape of the chair when Ruth shifted. 18 years of silence, Ruth thought. And now the world is shouting at him. They ate breakfast together. Silas kept glancing at her, then away, as though he could not quite believe she was real. "Your voice is getting stronger," Ruth observed. 18 years not speaking," Silas said. "The vocal cords atrophied. Doctor and Helena told me even if my hearing came back, I would never speak again. Said the damage was permanent." "Doctors are often wrong," Ruth said. "You need exercises, humming, tongue twisters, reading aloud." Silas looked at her with something that might have been hope. "Will you teach me?" he asked. Ruth felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unexpected. "That is what you married me for," she said. "Medical help." Silas set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "and something else." He did not finish the thought, but Ruth understood anyway. After breakfast, Silas led her outside. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world clean and white and silent. He walked to the back of the cabin where a small fenced area stood beneath a pine tree. A grave. Simple wooden cross. The inscription read, "Grace Eleanor Worth, 1861 to 1881, beloved wife." Ruth stood looking at the grave. Silas stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "I married before," he said. His voice was quiet. "Grace was everything. Kind. Patient. She did not care that I could not hear. We had 3 good years." He paused. Ruth waited. "She got pregnant. Winter of 81. We were happy, but the labor started early. I rode to town for the midwife. The snow was bad. By the time I got back with Mrs. Henderson, Grace had been in labor 19 hours. His voice tightened. She died. The baby, too. Breech birth. Cord wrapped around the neck. Mrs. Henderson tried everything, but it was too late." Ruth felt her chest constrict. She knew this story, knew how it ended, had lived a version of it herself with Sarah Garrett. "Reverend Kern was there," Silas continued. "He said Grace died because God was punishing me, that my affliction, the deafness, was a mark of sin, and Grace paid the price for my transgression. That is not how medicine works." Ruth said, her voice sharp with anger. "Breech births happen. It is not anyone's fault." "Try telling Bitterroot Valley that," Silas said. "The Reverend convinced everyone, said I was cursed. The town voted that I could not live within town limits. That is why I am up here." Ruth understood now. Silas was not just a deaf outcast. He was the widower who supposedly cursed his wife to death, the same way Ruth was the fat midwife who supposedly killed Sarah Garrett through incompetence. They were mirrors, 2 people blamed for tragedies they could not have prevented. "I am sorry," Ruth said. "About Grace, about what they did to you." "I am sorry about Sarah Garrett," Silas replied, "about what they did to you." They stood together in the snow, 2 survivors of other people's cruelty, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition, the beginning of something that might become trust. Over the next 3 days, Ruth examined Silas's ear carefully. She cleaned the wound, applied honey-based poultices to prevent infection, checked for any remaining debris. The extraction site was inflamed and tender, but healing. But she found something that troubled her. The scar tissue pattern in the ear canal suggested not one infection, but multiple episodes over years, as though the beetle larva had gone through cycles of activity and dormancy, or as though there had been more than one. She did not mention this to Silas yet, did not want to worry him until she was certain. Instead, she focused on his recovery. His hearing improved each day, though it remained imperfect. Some frequencies were clearer than others. He struggled with soft sounds, with differentiating multiple voices. But he could hear. After 18 years, he could hear. His voice strengthened too. Ruth gave him exercises, made him read aloud from the medical texts he kept. The practice was good for both of them. Silas relearned how to speak. Ruth learned advanced anatomy she had never studied formally. They worked side by side at the table in the evenings, lamplight falling across the pages of Gray's Anatomy, their shoulders nearly touching. Sometimes Silas would pause in his reading to look at her wonder still evident on his face. "I never thought," he said one night, "that I would have this again. Conversation. Company. Someone who does not look at me with pity or fear. I never thought I would have a partner who respected my skills," Ruth replied. "My first husband tolerated my interest in medicine. He never understood it, never valued it." "Then he was a fool," Silas said simply. Ruth felt heat rise in her face. She was not accustomed to compliments, not about her abilities, not about anything. "Thank you," she said quietly. They were building something, she realized, not a marriage in the traditional sense, but a partnership, an alliance of two people who understood what it meant to be dismissed and who had chosen to see each other clearly. It was fragile, new, but it was real. On the fourth day, the visitor came. Ruth was hanging laundry in the cold morning air when she heard the horse. She turned to see a rider approaching up the mountain trail. Deputy Owen Fletcher, uncomfortable in his saddle, his breath misting in the cold. Silas emerged from the barn, alerted by the sound of hoofbeats. He moved to stand beside Ruth, protective without being possessive. Deputy Fletcher reined in his horse and nodded to them both. He looked embarrassed. "Mr. Worth, Mrs. Worth, I apologize for the intrusion." "State your business, Deputy," Silas said. His voice was still rough but clear enough. Fletcher blinked, clearly surprised that Silas could speak. "I have a message from Reverend Kern," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "He requests Mrs. Worth's presence at Sunday service. Says she owes the congregation a public accounting for Sarah Garrett's death." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. "She owes them nothing," Silas said flatly. "Reverend says if she does not come, he will petition Judge Carver to annul the marriage. Claims you only married to avoid the asylum, which makes it fraud." Fletcher looked genuinely apologetic as he said it. Ruth's hands clenched. If the marriage was annulled, she would go straight to the asylum. Everything they had built in these 4 days would disappear. "I will go," she said. "Ruth." Silas turned to her, his expression alarmed. "You do not have to." "Yes, I do," she said. "If I do not, Reverend Kern wins. He destroys me without ever having to face me." "He will destroy you if you go. You will stand in front of the entire town and let him humiliate you." Ruth met his eyes. "I have been humiliated before," she said. "I can survive it. What I cannot survive is running, hiding, letting him control me through fear." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. She could see the conflict in his face, the desire to protect her, warring with the understanding that she had to fight her own battles. Finally he nodded. "Then I will come with you," he said. "You are banned from town," Ruth reminded him. "I do not care." Deputy Fletcher cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Worth, the ban was lifted last year. Judge Carver ruled it unconstitutional. You are welcome in town, though I would not say you would be welcomed if you understand my meaning." Silas smiled grimly. "I understand perfectly." Sunday morning came too quickly. Ruth dressed in her best dress, the one she had worn to marry Silas. It was plain, but clean, sturdy fabric that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Silas wore his suit, the same one from the wedding. They looked like what they were. Two people preparing for battle. The ride to Bitterroot Valley took 3 hours. They did not speak much. Silas kept glancing at Ruth, his concern evident. Ruth kept her eyes on the road ahead, her mind reviewing everything she wanted to say. The church was packed, every pew full, people standing in the back. All of Bitterroot Valley had turned out to witness Ruth Palmer Worth's humiliation. Reverend Joseph Kern stood at the pulpit, his face grave and righteous. He was a handsome man in his mid-50s, silver-haired and dignified. The kind of man people trusted instinctively. The kind of man who could destroy a reputation with a few well-chosen words. Ruth walked down the center aisle, Silas beside her. Whispers followed them. She heard the words clearly now. Fat, fraud, killer, cursed. She kept walking. She took a seat in the back pew. Silas sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. A silent statement of solidarity. Reverend Kern began his sermon. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice carrying through the church with practiced ease, "we gather today to address a cancer in our community. Mrs. Ruth Palmer Worth stands accused by grieving widower Thomas Garrett of malpractice, resulting in his beloved Sarah's death." Ruth's heart hammered, but she kept her face still. "This woman," Kern continued, "who lacks moral discipline in her own life, presumed to practice medicine without training, without certification, without God's blessing. The result was tragedy. A young wife dead, an unborn child lost, a family destroyed." He turned to look directly at Ruth. "Mrs. Worth, stand and repent. Confess your sin and perhaps mercy may be yours." The church was utterly silent. Every eye on Ruth. She stood, felt Silas tense beside her, felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her from every direction. And then she spoke. "I will confess to one thing, Reverend." Kern smiled, thinking he had won. "Yes," he said, "I failed Sarah Garrett." Ruth said, her voice steady and clear. "But not the way you think." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. "Sarah Garrett died of postpartum hemorrhage," Ruth continued. "A medical complication that occurs in one of every 200 births, regardless of the skill of the attending midwife. I could not have prevented it. No one could have." "You dare!" Thomas Garrett stood up from his pew, his face red. "You dare to blame Sarah for her own death." "I am not blaming Sarah," Ruth said. "I am blaming you." Gasps, shocked silence. "I failed Sarah because I did not notice the bruises on her arms," Ruth said. "I did not ask why she flinched when you entered the room during labor. I did not question why a wealthy woman insisted I deliver her baby at home in secret instead of at the hospital in Helena." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, her medical notes. "Sarah Garrett was not dying from childbirth complications," she said. "She was dying from months of internal injuries, old fractures, scarring, damage that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with repeated violence." Thomas Garrett's face went white. "She had a fractured rib that punctured her liver during the final contractions," Ruth continued. "That is what killed her. Not my incompetence, your brutality." Pandemonium, people shouting. Thomas Garrett lunging forward only to be held back by other men. Reverend Kern trying to restore order, his face furious. Ruth stood in the center of the chaos, her heart pounding, but her voice unwavering. "I have documented everything," she said. "Every bruise, every old injury, every symptom. And I am requesting a formal medical examination of Sarah's remains. Let a real doctor review the evidence. Let the truth speak." She looked directly at Reverend Kern. "Unless you would prefer to keep hiding the truth, Reverend, unless you would rather blame a fat midwife than address the violence in your own congregation." Kern's face was purple with rage, but he could not speak, could not refute her, could only watch as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled. Ruth sat down. Silas immediately took her hand, his grip firm and warm. She had done it. Declared war. There would be consequences, terrible ones probably, but she had spoken the truth, and that mattered more than safety. As the congregation erupted in argument and accusation, as Thomas Garrett was dragged from the church still shouting, as Reverend Kern tried desperately to regain control, Ruth and Silas sat together in the back pew. Two people against a town, two voices against a chorus of judgment, but they were not afraid, not anymore. They left the church as the sun began to set, the congregation still in chaos behind them. No one stopped them. No one even looked at them. Ruth climbed into the wagon, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Silas took the reins and guided the horse back toward the mountain road. They were a mile outside town when Ruth finally spoke. "I think I just declared war," she said. Silas glanced at her, and to her surprise, he was smiling. "Good," he said. "You will need an ally." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded telegram, handed it to Ruth. She unfolded it, read the words in the fading light. Dr. Margaret Hayes, Women's Medical College, Philadelphia. Arriving Bitterroot Valley, December 10th. Ready to examine Grace Worth's remains. Judge Carver. Ruth stared at the telegram. "You asked the judge to investigate Grace's death," she said. "You gave me the idea," Silas replied. "If we can prove Sarah Garrett's death was not your fault, maybe we can prove Grace's death was not mine." For the first time since they had met, Ruth smiled at him, really smiled. Not the polite expression of strangers, but the genuine warmth of partnership. "We are in this together then," she said. "Together," Silas agreed. They rode back toward the mountain, toward the cabin that was becoming home, toward a future neither of them had expected, but both were beginning to want. Behind them, Bitterroot Valley burned with rumor and rage. Ahead of them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. And between them, something fragile and new and worth fighting for began to grow. But their peace would not last. Even as they crested the ridge and saw the cabin lights in the distance, even as they allowed themselves a moment of hope, riders were gathering in the valley below. Torches being lit, anger being stoked. The mob was coming, and the real battle had only just begun. The sound reached them before they saw the torches. A low rumble of hooves and voices carried on the night wind. Ruth stood at the cabin window watching the distant lights snake up the mountain trail like a line of angry fireflies. 20 men, maybe more, all on horseback, all coming for her. Silas moved beside her, his face grim in the lamplight. His hand rested on the rifle he kept mounted above the door. Ruth had not known it was there until this moment. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Too many to fight," Ruth said, "even if we wanted to." The mob crested the final ridge and entered the clearing around the cabin. Thomas Garrett rode at the front, drunk and swaying in his saddle. Beside him, Reverend Joseph Kern sat straight and righteous, his silver hair catching the torchlight like a halo. Behind them, faces Ruth recognized: shopkeepers, ranchers, men she had treated for ailments, whose children she had delivered, whose wives she had helped through difficult pregnancies. Now they rode against her torches, held high faces, hard with judgment. Reverend Kern raised his hand. The mob stopped. "Silas Worth," he called out, "send out the woman. She has slandered a grieving husband and must answer for it." Silas opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. Ruth moved to stand beside him. She felt his tension, the coiled readiness of a man prepared to defend what was his. But when he spoke, his voice was level, calm. "This is private property," he said. "You are trespassing." Shock rippled through the mob. Men exchanged glances, whispers. The cursed man can speak. Thomas Garrett laughed, the sound ugly and slurred. "Witch," he spat. "She healed him with dark arts, devil's work." Ruth stepped forward before Silas could respond. "I removed a beetle larva from his ear," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "It is called surgery. It is documented in every medical text written in the last 50 years. There is nothing supernatural about it." "You made serious accusations today, Mrs. Worth," Reverend Kern said. His voice was smooth, controlled, a preacher's voice designed to command and persuade. "Do you have proof that Thomas Garrett harmed his wife?" "I have medical documentation," Ruth replied. "I have requested a formal autopsy." "Desecrating a Christian woman's grave." The Reverend's voice rose with practiced outrage. "This is blasphemy." "Then Mr. Garrett has nothing to fear from examination," Ruth said. "Medical evidence will speak the truth." Thomas lurched forward in his saddle. "I will not let you dig up my wife to cover your incompetence," he shouted. You killed her with your fat hands and your ignorance, and now you try to blame me?" The words hung in the cold air. Ruth felt them like blows. Fat, ignorant, killer. The same words she had heard her entire life weaponized and aimed at her heart. But before she could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the trail. Another rider approaching fast. Judge Henry Carver emerged from the darkness, his horse lathered with sweat. He had ridden hard to get here. Ruth realized with sudden clarity that he had been following the mob waiting to intervene if violence seemed imminent. "Gentlemen," the judge said, his voice tired but firm, "this gathering is illegal. You are on Mr. Worth's property without permission. I suggest you disperse before I am forced to bring charges." "With respect, Your Honor," Reverend Kern said. "Mrs. Worth has made serious accusations against a respected member of our community. She cannot be allowed to hide behind her marriage and escape justice." Judge Carver dismounted slowly. He was an old man, Ruth saw, older than she had realized. The ride up the mountain had cost him. "Mrs. Worth has legal right to request medical review of any death she attended," the judge said. "If Mr. Garrett refuses examination, that refusal can be presented to territorial court as evidence of obstruction." Thomas Garrett's face went purple. "You cannot force me to consent to this. She is lying, making up stories to save herself." "Then prove her wrong," Judge Carver said simply. "Let Dr. Margaret Hayes examine the remains. If Mrs. Worth's claims are false, she will face charges of slander and fraud. If they are true, you will face charges of assault and possibly manslaughter." The judge looked at Reverend Kern. "Fair terms, I think." For a long moment, no one spoke. The torches crackled and hissed. Horses stamped and shifted. Men looked at each other, uncertain now that legal authority had arrived. Finally, Thomas Garrett spat into the snow. "Fine," he snarled. "Dig her up. You will find nothing. Dr. Hayes will arrive in 4 days," Judge Carver said. "She will examine both bodies, Sarah Garrett and Grace Worth. We will have medical facts, not accusations or speculation." He turned to address the mob. "Until then, Mr. and Mrs. Worth are to be left in peace. Anyone who harms them or their property will face federal charges. Am I understood?" Reluctant nods. Grumbled agreement. Reverend Kern's face was tight with controlled anger. He had expected to cow Ruth into submission to force a public confession. Instead, he had been outmaneuvered by an old judge and a woman who refused to break. "This is not finished," he said quietly. "No," Judge Carver agreed, "but it will be finished legally, with evidence and testimony, not with torches and threats." The mob dispersed slowly, reluctantly. Thomas Garrett was the last to leave, turning his horse with drunken fury and galloping down the trail into darkness. When the last torch had disappeared, Judge Carver turned to Ruth and Silas. "You made powerful enemies today, Mrs. Worth." "I spoke the truth," Ruth said. "Truth and safety are not always compatible," the judge replied. He looked tired, ancient. "But I will do what I can to protect you, both of you." "Why?" Silas asked. "Why risk your position for us?" Judge Carver smiled sadly. "Because I have spent 40 years watching the law fail people who needed it most. Women, the poor, those who did not fit the mold of respectability. I am too old to change the system. But perhaps I can bend it enough to shelter a few souls who deserve better." He mounted his horse with effort. "Be careful," he said. "Reverend Kern is more dangerous than Thomas Garrett. Garrett is a brute, but Kern is intelligent, calculating. He will not come at you directly. He will find another way." The judge rode away, leaving Ruth and Silas alone in the clearing. Inside the cabin, Ruth collapsed into a chair. Her hands shook with delayed reaction. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving only exhaustion. "I gambled everything on a theory," she said. "What if I am wrong? What if Dr. Hayes finds no evidence of abuse?" Silas knelt in front of her chair. "Was it just a theory?" he asked. Ruth thought of Sarah Garrett, the fingerprint bruises on her wrists, the way she had flinched when Thomas entered the room, The old fractures Ruth had felt through the skin during examination, but had dismissed as accidents. "No," she said. "It was not a theory. Sarah had defensive wounds, signs of chronic trauma. But what if I missed something? What if the internal injuries were from something else?" Silas took her hands in his. "Ruth, look at me." She met his eyes. "I spent 18 years being told my pain was not real," he said, "that I was imagining it, that I needed to accept my brokenness and stop seeking help. 7 doctors dismissed me without truly examining me. 7. His grip tightened on her hands. "You believed me when no one else did. You looked when others turned away. You found the truth." "This is different," Ruth said. "Sarah is dead. I cannot ask her what happened. I can only interpret evidence." "Then trust your interpretation," Silas said. "Trust your training. Trust your instincts. You have earned that right." Ruth felt tears burn her eyes. She had spent so long doubting herself, accepting other people's judgments, internalizing their contempt. Hearing Silas speak such confidence in her abilities felt like absolution. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas stood, pulled her to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her. Ruth leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They stood that way for a long time. No words, just presence, the comfort of not being alone. Outside, the wind picked up howling through the pines. Inside, the fire burned low. And between two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate tragedies, something deeper than partnership began to grow, something that felt like love. The next morning brought another visitor, this one unexpected. Ruth was preparing breakfast when she heard the knock. Silas tensed, reaching instinctively for the rifle, but the voice that called out was female and elderly. "Mrs. Worth, please, no harm. I need to speak with you." Silas opened the door cautiously. An older woman stood on the porch wrapped in a heavy coat against the cold. Her face was lined with age and sorrow. Ruth recognized her immediately. Helen Garrett, Thomas Garrett's mother. "May I come in?" Helen asked. "I have something to tell you, something important." Ruth nodded to Silas. He stepped aside, letting the woman enter. Helen Garrett moved stiffly to the table and sat down. She was perhaps 65, gray-haired and dignified, despite her obvious distress. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Ruth with red-rimmed eyes. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did my son hurt Sarah?" Ruth chose her words carefully. "I believe so, but I need Dr. Hayes to confirm my findings." Helen closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her weathered cheek. "I knew," she said. "God help me, I suspected. Sarah came to me once with bruises on her arms. She said she had fallen. But the way she said it, the way she looked away when she spoke, I knew she was lying." "Why did you not help her?" Ruth asked gently. "Because I did not want to believe my boy could do such things," Helen said. "I raised him, fed him, loved him. How could I accept that he had become a monster?" She pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, pressed it to her eyes. "But that is not why I came. I came to tell you something about Reverend Kern, something Sarah told me before she died." Ruth and Silas exchanged glances. "What did she tell you?" Ruth asked. Helen took a shaking breath. "Sarah confessed to me that she was having an affair with Joseph Kern." The words fell like stones into still water. "The Reverend," Ruth said. "It started a year ago," Helen continued. "Sarah came to him for counseling. Her marriage was difficult. Thomas drank, lost his temper. Joseph offered comfort, spiritual guidance, but it became more." She twisted the handkerchief in her hands. "Sarah got pregnant. She did not know if the baby was Thomas's or Joseph's. She was terrified. She went to Joseph for help." Helen looked up, met Ruth's eyes. "He gave her herbs, said they would calm her nerves, help her sleep. But I think he was trying to end the pregnancy." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. "Abortifacients," she said. "I do not know the medical term," Helen said, But Sarah was bleeding before labor started. She told me the herbs made her sick, made her cramp, but she kept taking them because Joseph told her to trust him. Ruth's mind raced. Abortifacient herbs in late pregnancy would cause contractions, potentially trigger premature labor, and in high doses could cause hemorrhaging. The bleeding during labor, Ruth said slowly. It was not just from delivery complications. She was already hemorrhaging from the herbs. Helen nodded miserably. I think Joseph tried to end the pregnancy and failed. The baby was too far along, and when Sarah went into labor, the damage was already done. Why did you not tell anyone? Silas asked. Because Sarah made me promise, Helen said. She was ashamed, afraid. She did not want anyone to know about the affair. And after she died, I thought, what good would it do? She was gone. The baby was gone. Speaking would only destroy more lives. She looked at Ruth. But then I heard what you said in church, how you were blamed for Sarah's death, how Joseph stood in the pulpit and called you incompetent, and I realized he is letting you take the blame for what he did. Do you have proof? Ruth asked. Anything in writing. Helen reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Sarah's diary. She wrote everything. The affair, the pregnancy, the herbs Joseph gave her, everything. She handed the book to Ruth. I want you to have it. Use it to clear your name. Use it to make Joseph answer for what he did. Ruth took the diary with trembling hands. This changed everything. If Sarah had documented the affair, the herbs, the hemorrhaging, it would prove that Ruth had not caused her death, that Reverend Kern had. Thank you, Ruth said. This took courage. No, Helen said. Courage would have been helping Sarah when she was alive. This is just atonement. She stood to leave. Will you testify? Ruth asked. When Dr. Hayes arrives, Helen hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I will tell the truth, all of it. Even if it destroys my family's reputation, Sarah deserves that much. After Helen left, Ruth opened the diary with shaking hands. Page after page of Sarah Garrett's neat handwriting, confessions, fears, desperate prayers, and detailed descriptions of the herbs Reverend Kern had given her. Pennyroyal, black cohosh, tansy, all known abortifacients, all dangerous in high doses. Silas read over her shoulder. He killed her, he said quietly. Maybe not intentionally, but he gave her poison, and it killed her. And then he blamed me, Ruth said. Stood in the pulpit and called me incompetent to hide his own guilt. Anger burned in her chest, hot and righteous. We have to tell Judge Carver, she said. We will, Silas agreed. But first we prepare. When Dr. Hayes arrives, we give her everything. Medical notes, diary, testimony. We build a case so strong that even Reverend Kern cannot talk his way out of it. Ruth nodded. They had 4 days until Dr. Hayes arrived. 4 days to document everything, to prepare their evidence, to make sure the truth could not be denied. They worked without rest. Ruth reviewed her medical notes on Sarah Garrett's delivery, adding observations she had dismissed at the time. The old bruises, the way Sarah had whispered, "Please do not tell Thomas," when Ruth asked about injuries. The bleeding that had started before full labor. Silas helped her organize the information, his veterinary training giving him insight into anatomy and physiology. Together, they created a comprehensive medical timeline of Sarah's final months. They also spent hours each evening on Silas's recovery. His hearing continued to improve, though it would never be perfect. Some frequencies remained muffled. Background noise overwhelmed him, but he could hear conversation, could distinguish individual voices, could participate in the world in ways he had not been able to for 18 years. His voice strengthened too. The exercises Ruth gave him worked. Each day he read aloud from medical texts, slowly rebuilding the neural pathways between thought and speech. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Silas paused in his reading and looked at her. "Ruth," he said, "I need to tell you something." She set down her own book and gave him her full attention. "When Judge Carver first proposed this marriage, I agreed because I needed medical help. That was true, but there was another reason. He reached for the slate old habit, then seemed to remember he could speak. He set it aside. "I was lonely," he said. 18 years alone on this mountain. 18 years with no one to talk to, no one who saw me as anything other than cursed or broken. I thought even if this marriage is just a transaction, at least I will have company." He looked at her directly. But somewhere between the extraction and the church confrontation and sitting here reading together, it stopped being a transaction, at least for me. Ruth's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. "I am saying that I am grateful you pulled that beetle from my skull, but I am more grateful for everything that came after, for your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to accept other people's judgments, for you." He took her hand. "I know this started as mutual survival, but I would like it to become something more, if you want that too." Ruth felt tears sting her eyes. She had been married before to a man who had tolerated her existence but never valued her, who had seen her as property, as a burden, as something to be endured. Silas saw her as a partner, an equal, someone worth choosing. "I want that," she said. "I want this to be real." Silas smiled, not the tentative expression he had worn before, but something full and genuine and beautiful. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Ruth did not pull away. She met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative. The kiss of two people learning each other for the first time. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I have never been kissed like that," Ruth said. "Like what?" Silas asked. "Like I matter." Silas cupped her face in his scarred hands. "You matter more than you know." They sat together by the fire, holding each other as the night deepened around them. Outside, winter pressed against the windows. Inside, warmth and hope and the beginning of love. Dr. Margaret Hayes arrived on December 10th, exactly as promised. She came in a hired carriage accompanied by Judge Carver and a young assistant who carried her medical equipment. She was a formidable woman. 45 years old, stern-faced with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a practical traveling suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought for every inch of respect she commanded. Ruth met her at the door, suddenly nervous. This woman was everything Ruth aspired to be: educated, certified, recognized. What if Dr. Hayes found Ruth's theories baseless? What if 18 years of self-education meant nothing compared to formal training? But Dr. Hayes extended her hand with a firm grip and a small smile. "Mrs. Worth, Judge Carver has told me about your case. I am intrigued." They worked together for 2 days, first examining Grace Worth's remains, which required exhuming the grave behind the cabin. It was grim work. Silas stood at a distance, unable to watch. Dr. Hayes worked methodically, documenting everything. Ruth assisted handling instruments, taking notes, learning from every observation. "After 6 hours, Doctor." Hayes straightened and removed her gloves. "Grace Worth died of postpartum hemorrhage secondary to placental abruption," she said. "The fetus was breached with nuchal cord entanglement, double complication, either one of which could have been fatal." She looked at Silas, who had finally approached. "Mr. Worth, there is nothing in these remains that suggests curse or divine punishment. This was medical tragedy. Mrs. Henderson, the attending midwife, did everything correctly with the medical knowledge available in 1881. You could not have prevented this. No one could have." Silas stood very still. Ruth saw his throat work, saw the tears that filled his eyes. 18 years, he said hoarsely. 18 years I thought I killed her." "You did not," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "You loved her. You tried to get help. You did everything a husband could do. Her death was not your fault." Silas turned away, overcome. Ruth went to him, wrapped her arms around him as he wept. Not the quiet tears from before, but deep, wrenching kisses. Grief and relief and the release of guilt he had carried for so long. Dr. Hayes watched with sympathy, then tactfully moved away to give them privacy. When Silas had composed himself, they turned their attention to Sarah Garrett. The exhumation of Sarah Garrett's body was performed in Bitterroot Valley under Judge Carver's supervision. Thomas Garrett was required to attend his face a mask of fury and fear. Dr. Hayes worked with the same methodical precision. Ruth assisted again, this time with Helen Garrett present as witness. The examination took most of a day. When Dr. Hayes finally emerged from the makeshift examination room in the courthouse, her face was grave. "Multiple healed fractures," she announced to the assembled witnesses. 3 ribs, left radius, right clavicle, all between 6 months and 1 year old at time of death. She consulted her notes. Extensive internal scarring, evidence of repeated blunt force trauma to the abdomen, and most significantly, a lacerated liver that shows signs of both old and new damage. "Meaning what?" Judge Carver asked. "Meaning Mrs. Garrett had been systematically beaten for months before her death. The final labor contractions caused the damaged liver to rupture completely, resulting in internal hemorrhaging that would have been impossible to stop without surgical intervention." Dr. Hayes looked at Thomas Garrett. "Mrs. Worth did not kill your wife, Mr. Garrett. You did." Thomas lunged forward. Sheriff Fletcher and 2 deputies restrained him. "Lies!" he screamed. "All lies. She was clumsy. She fell. She was always falling." "The fracture patterns are inconsistent with falling," Dr. Hayes said coldly. "They are consistent with defensive injuries and direct blows." She turned to Judge Carver. "There is one more thing. Chemical analysis of tissue samples shows high levels of pennyroyal oil and other compounds consistent with abortifacient herbs. Someone gave Mrs. Garrett these substances in the weeks before her death." Ruth pulled out Sarah's diary and handed it to the judge. "Sarah documented everything," she said, "including who gave her the herbs." Judge Carver read the diary in silence. His face grew darker with each page. Finally, he looked up. "Sheriff Fletcher, you are to arrest Reverend Joseph Kern immediately. Charges include administering dangerous substances without medical license, adultery, and accessory to manslaughter." The sheriff nodded and left with his deputies. Thomas Garrett stopped struggling. All the fight went out of him. "The Reverend," he said. "Joseph Kern gave Sarah poison. He gave her abortifacients," Dr. Hayes said, "likely attempting to end a pregnancy, but Mrs. Garrett was too far along. The herbs triggered premature labor and caused additional hemorrhaging that, combined with her existing injuries, proved fatal." She looked at Thomas without sympathy. "Your wife died because 2 men harmed her. You with your fists, Reverend Kern with his herbs and his lies. Mrs. Worth tried to save her and could not. The blame lies with you, not her." Reverend Joseph Kern was arrested during evening service. He did not resist, did not protest, simply stood from the pulpit and allowed himself to be led away in chains. The trial began 2 weeks later. All of Bitterroot Valley crowded into the courthouse to witness the fall of their spiritual leader. Ruth sat in the front row beside Silas, their hands clasped together. Dr. Hayes sat on her other side, ready to provide expert testimony. The prosecutor was thorough. He presented Sarah's diary, reading passages aloud. The affair, the pregnancy, the fear, the herbs Reverend Kern had given her with promises they would help. He called Dr. Hayes, who testified about the medical evidence, the abortifacients in Sarah's tissue, the damage they had caused, the impossibility of Ruth preventing death once the hemorrhaging started. He called Helen Garrett, who testified through tears about Sarah's confession, about the Reverend's manipulation, about the guilt of staying silent. And finally he called Ruth. She took the stand with her medical notes in hand, answered questions about Sarah's delivery, about the symptoms she had observed, about the limitations of medicine in a home birth situation. "Did you cause Sarah Garrett's death?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Ruth said clearly. "I did everything possible to save her, but she had been poisoned and beaten. No midwife could have prevented her death under those circumstances." Yet Reverend Kern publicly blamed you. "Yes, he stood in the pulpit and called me incompetent, called me negligent, tried to have me committed to an asylum." Why do you think he did that? Ruth looked directly at Reverend Kern to hide his own guilt, to deflect blame onto someone that society already looked down on, a fat woman, an uneducated midwife, someone no one would defend. But you defended yourself. Yes, because Sarah Garrett deserved the truth, and because I was tired of being invisible. The prosecutor nodded satisfied. During cross-examination, Reverend Kern's lawyer tried to discredit Ruth, questioned her training, suggested she was lying to save herself, but Dr. Hayes's testimony stood. Medical evidence did not lie. When the defense rested, everyone expected Reverend Kern to maintain his dignified silence. But as the prosecutor began his closing argument, Kern suddenly stood. "Enough," he said. His lawyer tried to stop him, but Kern shook him off. "She is twisting everything," he said, his voice rising. "Sarah came to me because her husband was a monster. I was trying to help her." "Reverend Kern," Judge Carver warned, "I advise you to sit down and consult with your attorney." But Kern could not stop. 18 months of secrets and guilt came pouring out. "The herbs were supposed to ease her pain. I did not know she was that far along. It was an accident. I never meant for her to die." He turned to face the courtroom, his face desperate. "And yes, I blamed that woman because someone had to take responsibility. You think I could admit I caused this? My reputation, my ministry, everything I built, all of it would be destroyed." "Reverend Kern," his lawyer said urgently, "stop talking." But Kern was beyond reason now. "I am not a murderer. I was trying to help. Sarah loved me. She came to me willingly. The affair was her idea. And when she got pregnant, she begged me to fix it. What was I supposed to do? Let her bear a bastard ruin both our lives?" Judge Carver banged his gavel. "Reverend Kern, you are confessing to multiple crimes in open court." Kern seemed to realize what he had done. The color drained from his face. He sat down heavily, his hands shaking. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Carver called for order, then addressed the jury. "Gentlemen, you have heard a confession. I instruct you to consider it as evidence along with all medical testimony and documentation." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all charges. Reverend Joseph Kern was sentenced to 15 years hard labor. Thomas Garrett, tried separately, received 10 years for assault. All charges against Ruth Palmer Worth were dismissed with a formal apology from the court. The weeks following the trial were strange. Bitterroot Valley divided into factions. Some people apologized to Ruth, shamefaced and sincere. Others avoided her, unable to admit they had been wrong. A few continued to whisper that she had somehow seduced both the Reverend and Silas, that she was more dangerous than anyone realized. Ruth found she did not care. Their opinions no longer had power over her. She and Silas returned to the mountain cabin. Winter deepened. Snow fell, and in the isolation and quiet, they built something neither had expected. A real marriage, not a transaction, not an arrangement, but a partnership based on respect and growing affection. On New Year's Eve, they sat together by the fire. The cabin was warm. A simple meal sat on the table. No champagne, no celebration, just the two of them. "Ruth," Silas said, "I need to ask you something." She looked at him, curious. "Our marriage started as survival," he said. "You needed escape from the asylum. I needed medical help. Fair trade." He took her hand. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. For me, at least. It became real. You became the person I think about when I wake up, the person I want to share my thoughts with, the person whose smile makes me happy. He paused, searching for words. "I am asking if you want to stay married, not because the law says you must, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to, because you choose me." Ruth felt her throat tighten. She thought of her first husband who had married her for land and had never once asked what she wanted, who had treated her as an obligation. Silas was offering her choice, agency, the power to decide her own future. "I have been chosen before," she said quietly. "My first husband chose me because I came with property. He tolerated me but never saw me, never valued me." She reached up, cupped Silas's weathered face in her hands. You see me, not my size, not my failures, just me. The person I am underneath all the judgment and shame, she smiled through tears. So yes, I choose this, I choose you, I choose us. Silas kissed her. Not the gentle tentative kiss from before. This was deeper, more certain. The kiss of two people who had found each other against impossible odds and were determined to keep what they had built. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. I love you, Silas said. I do not know when it happened, but I do. I love you too, Ruth replied. Even though you are stubborn and overprotective and read anatomy texts too slowly. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. They held each other as the old year gave way to the new, as midnight passed unmarked except by the beating of their hearts, as the future opened before them with possibilities they had never imagined. The letter arrived in early January, official stationery from the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. Ruth opened it with shaking hands, read the elegant script, then sat down heavily. Dr. Hayes had nominated her for admission. The college was accepting applications for the fall term. If Ruth was interested, Dr. Hayes would sponsor her, provide recommendations, help with the process. 3 years of formal medical training, real certification. The respect and recognition Ruth had always dreamed of, but it would mean leaving Silas, leaving Montana, leaving the life they were building. Ruth stared at the letter torn between desire and duty. That night she showed it to Silas. He read it twice, then looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. You should go, he said. Ruth blinked, startled. What? To Philadelphia. You should study. But your ear, your recovery. What if the infection returns? What if you need help? Silas took her hands. Doctor, Hayes taught me how to care for it. I will be fine. But Ruth, this is your dream. The thing you have wanted your entire life. I will not be the person who holds you back from it. You would not be holding me back. You would be my home. Then I will be here when you return, Silas said. 3 years, 5 years, however long it takes. I will wait. Ruth shook her head. That is not fair to you. It is not about fair. It is about loving someone enough to let them grow. Ruth looked at the letter, then at Silas, then back at the letter. An idea formed. Impossible, audacious, but maybe just maybe possible. What if we both went, she said. Silas stared at her. I cannot afford medical school. But you could afford veterinary school, Ruth said, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. Dr. Hayes mentioned the University of Pennsylvania has a veterinary program. You wanted to be a veterinarian before the mine accident, before the beetle, before everything. She pulled out the small amount of money she had saved money from selling her first husband's land. We have enough for both of us if we are careful, if we live simply, work while we study. Ruth, you cannot plan your entire life around me. I am not planning around you. I am planning with you. There is a difference. She gripped his hands tightly. I do not want to choose between career and marriage. I want both. And I think we can have both if we are willing to work for it. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, wonderfully, he smiled. Philadelphia, he said. Together. Together, Ruth agreed. They spent the next month preparing, selling unnecessary possessions, arranging for neighbors to watch the cabin, writing to the colleges to confirm admission possibilities. Judge Carver helped with the legal paperwork. Mrs. Henderson promised to keep the medical practice alive in Ruth's absence, training her granddaughter to take over eventually. Even Helen Garrett contributed, donating money to help with expenses. Atonement, she said, for not helping Sarah when she had the chance. By early March, everything was arranged. On a cold morning with snow falling thick and fast, Ruth and Silas loaded their few belongings onto a wagon and headed down the mountain toward Bitterroot Valley. The town gathered to see them off. Not everyone, but enough. People who had come to respect Ruth's courage, to admire Silas's resilience, to hope that maybe change was possible. Mrs. Henderson hugged Ruth tightly. Come back and teach us what you learn, she said. I will. Ruth promised. Judge Carver shook Silas's hand. You are both examples of what people can become when they refuse to accept other people's limitations. Do not forget where you came from. We will not, Silas said. The train to Philadelphia left at noon. Ruth and Silas boarded together, found seats near the window, and watched as Montana rolled past. Mountains giving way to plains, wilderness giving way to civilization, the past giving way to the future. Are you scared? Ruth asked. Terrified, Silas admitted. I have never been east of Helena. Neither have I. Good thing we are terrified together then, he said, taking her hand. Ruth leaned against his shoulder as the train carried them toward a future neither could have imagined 6 months ago, toward education and opportunity and the chance to become everything they had been told they could never be. Behind them, Bitterroot Valley faded into distance and memory. Ahead, Philadelphia waited with all its challenges and possibilities. And between them, love and partnership and the unshakable certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountain had tested them. The truth had freed them. Now the world was theirs to claim. Philadelphia in winter was nothing like Montana. The city pressed in from all sides, buildings stacked on buildings, people crowding the streets, noise and smoke, and the constant clatter of progress. Ruth and Silas arrived in March of 1885 with 2 trunks and enough money to last 3 months if they were careful. They found a boarding house near the university, 1 room, a shared kitchen, walls so thin they could hear their neighbors breathing. It was the hardest 3 years of Ruth's life, and the best. The Women's Medical College did not welcome her with open arms. She was older than most students, self-taught rather than classically educated, and fat in a profession that valued the appearance of discipline and control. Her anatomy professor told her the first week that women had no place in medicine, that their emotional nature made them unsuitable for the rigors of scientific study, that Ruth in particular should consider a career in nursing instead. Ruth passed his final exam with the highest marks in the class. The obstetrics professor dismissed her theories about postpartum hemorrhaging, said her experience with Sarah Garrett had clearly traumatized her into seeing complications where none existed. Ruth wrote a paper on recognizing signs of domestic violence in pregnant patients. It was published in the American Journal of Obstetrics 3 months later. The surgery instructor told her she lacked the physical strength required for operating. Ruth assisted in 23 successful surgeries her 2nd year, performed her first solo appendectomy her 3rd year. The patient lived. Every day was a battle, every lecture a test, every clinical rotation an opportunity to prove herself. Ruth fought for every inch of respect she gained, and she gained it. Silas had his own struggles. The University of Pennsylvania veterinary program accepted him, but made clear he was a charity case, an older student with limited formal education and a history of disability. They expected him to fail. He did not fail. He worked nights at the stockyards to pay expenses, studied during breaks, practiced surgical techniques on cadavers until his hands moved with the certainty of muscle memory. His professors were surprised by his knowledge. He had spent years treating animals on the mountain, learning through trial and necessity. What he lacked in theory, he compensated with practical experience. By the end of the 1st year, they stopped treating him like charity. By the end of the 2nd year, they were asking his opinion on difficult cases. Through it all, Ruth and Silas held each other up. On nights when Ruth came home in tears from another professor's cruelty, Silas reminded her why she was fighting. When Silas doubted whether he belonged in a classroom, Ruth showed him how far he had already come. They studied together at their small table, ate cheap meals and dreamed of the future, made love quietly in their narrow bed, while the city rumbled around them. And slowly, impossibly, they both succeeded. Ruth graduated in May of 1888, 7th in her class of 30 women. Dr. Margaret Hayes stood in the audience crying with pride. Silas graduated 2 weeks later, first in his class of 12 veterinary students. Judge Carver had sent a telegram of congratulations that Silas kept folded in his pocket. They stood together outside the university on graduation day, diplomas in hand, credentials earned through blood and sweat, and stubborn refusal to quit. "We made it," Ruth said wonderingly. "We did," Silas agreed. Dr. Hayes approached them with an offer. A position for Ruth at Philadelphia Women's Hospital, good salary, opportunity to work with the best doctors in the country. Ruth was tempted. Philadelphia had given her education recognition respect she had never known in Montana. But that night, lying beside Silas in their boarding house room, she thought about what they had left behind. The mountain cabin, the wide sky, the people who needed doctors but could not afford the train fare to cities. "Silas," she said into the darkness, "do you want to stay here?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Philadelphia gave us everything we needed," he said finally, "but it is not home." "No," Ruth agreed, "it is not." Judge Carver wrote last month, said Bitterroot Valley has not had a proper doctor since old Doc Miller died. They are desperate. Ruth thought about the town that had once driven them out, the same town that had gathered to see them off 3 years ago with hope in their eyes. "If we go back, we do it on our terms," she said. "I want a real clinic, not a room in someone's house, a proper medical facility." "I want a veterinary practice that serves ranchers," Silas said, "not rich people's pets." "We would be starting from nothing." "We have done harder things," Silas pointed out. Ruth smiled in the darkness. "We have, haven't we?" The decision was made. They were going home. Bitterroot Valley in June of 1888 looked both the same and utterly different. The railroad had brought growth. New buildings lined Main Street. New families had settled. The town had doubled in size, but some things had not changed. The mountains still rose against the sky. The valley still stretched wide and green, and the people still needed healing. Judge Henry Carver met them at the train station. He had aged in 3 years, moved slower, breathed harder, but his smile was genuine and warm. "Dr. Worth," he said, shaking Ruth's hand. "Dr. Worth," he said to Silas, shaking his as well, "welcome home." The title felt strange and wonderful. Dr. Worth. Not Mrs. Worth, the midwife. Not Ruth, the fat woman who killed Sarah Garrett. Dr. Ruth Worth, certified physician. Building the clinic took 4 months. The town council donated land. Helen Garrett donated funds. Local ranchers provided labor. Even Sheriff Fletcher helped hammering nails alongside former doubters who had decided Ruth deserved a second chance. The clinic opened in October. 3 examination rooms, a small surgical suite, a ward with 6 beds for patients who needed overnight care, and above it all, living quarters for Ruth and Silas. Silas established his veterinary practice in a converted barn on the edge of town, large enough for horses and cattle, clean and well-equipped, the first proper animal hospital in Montana Territory. Patients came slowly at first. People who remembered the scandal were cautious. But when Mrs. Henderson sent her pregnant granddaughter to Ruth, when the ranchers saw Silas save a prize breeding mare, everyone else had given up on word spread. By winter, the clinic was busy. Ruth treated everything from broken bones to pneumonia to difficult births. She hired Mrs. Henderson as her assistant, teaching the older woman advanced techniques while learning from her decades of practical experience. Silas's practice thrived as well. Ranchers rode from 3 counties to consult him. He taught animal husbandry, published articles in veterinary journals, became known as the best livestock doctor in Montana. They had achieved what seemed impossible, but Ruth's greatest test was still ahead. Anna Bishop came to the clinic in July of 1889, 19 years old, 7 months pregnant, terrified. Ruth recognized the signs immediately. The way Anna flinched at sudden movements, the defensive bruising on her arms, the careful way she moved protecting her abdomen. "Mrs. Bishop," Ruth said gently, Are you safe at home?" Anna's eyes filled with tears. "My husband," she whispered. "He drinks, gets angry. I am afraid he will kill the baby. Or me." Ruth felt ice in her veins. She was seeing Sarah Garrett all over again. Young, pregnant, trapped. But this time Ruth had power she had not possessed 3 years ago. "You do not have to go back to him," Ruth said. "The law says I belong to my husband," Anna said hopelessly. "I have nowhere else to go." "There are ways," Ruth said carefully, "if you want help, if you are willing to leave everything behind and start over." Anna looked up, hope and fear warring in her expression. "What kind of ways?" That night Ruth met with Mrs. Henderson and 3 other women in the back room of the clinic. They called themselves the Valley Women's Circle. Publicly, they organized church socials and quilting bees. Privately, they ran an underground network helping women escape abusive marriages. "Can we get her out?" Ruth asked. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "We have done it before. We can do it again. But it has to look legitimate. Husband cannot suspect or he will hunt her down." They planned carefully. Anna would give birth at the clinic. Ruth would list complications that required Anna to stay for extended recovery. During that time, they would arrange transport to Oregon, create new identity papers, find her placement with a sympathetic family. Anna's husband would be told his wife and baby died in childbirth. There would be a funeral, an empty coffin, grief he would be expected to display publicly, and Anna would live, would raise her child in safety, would have the chance Sarah Garrett never got. The plan worked perfectly. Anna delivered a healthy baby girl in late August. Ruth created false death certificates. The circle arranged a convincing funeral. Anna's husband wept at the graveside, genuinely grieving or genuinely relieved, Ruth could not tell which. 3 days later, Anna and her daughter were on a train west with new names and new lives. Ruth kept Anna's real medical records hidden. Evidence of the abuse, documentation of the escape, insurance in case anyone ever questioned the death. Silas found Ruth in the clinic that night staring at the false death certificate she had signed. "I just committed fraud," she said. "I could lose my medical license." Silas sat beside her. "You saved 2 lives. That is what doctors do." "Lawyers would not see it that way." "Then we do not tell lawyers," he said simply. "We keep the secret. We live with the weight of it. And we accept that sometimes healing requires breaking rules." Ruth looked at him. "You are not concerned." "I am terrified," Silas admitted, "but I am also proud. You saw a woman in danger and you helped her. You gave her what no one gave Sarah, a choice, a chance. That matters more than any law." Ruth leaned against him, drawing strength from his certainty. "I hope Anna finds happiness," she said. "She will," Silas said. "Because of you, she will." In late August of 1889, Ruth discovered she was pregnant. The realization hit her during a routine examination of another patient. The nausea she had been attributing to stress, the fatigue, the tender breasts. All symptoms she had seen in hundreds of other women. She was 6 weeks along, which meant the baby would arrive in late April or early May. Ruth sat alone in the examination room after the patient left, staring at her own hands. These hands that had delivered 23 babies in Philadelphia, 57 in Bitterroot Valley. Hands that had saved lives and eased suffering and proven her competence again and again. But now those hands were shaking, because all she could think about was Sarah Garrett bleeding out on white sheets. Grace Worth dying in childbirth while her husband rode desperately for help, the fragility of life, the randomness of death. She told Silas that night, watched his face transform from confusion to understanding to pure joy. "A baby," he breathed. "Ruth, we are going to have a baby." "I am terrified," she said. His smile faded. "Why? Because women die in childbirth. I have seen it. I have failed to prevent it. What if I cannot save myself? What if our child grows up without a mother because I could not do for myself what I do for others?" Silas pulled her into his arms. "You are the best doctor in Montana. You have delivered hundreds of babies successfully. You know more about childbirth than anyone in this territory." "I cannot treat myself. I cannot be objective about my own body." "Then we get Dr. Hayes here, or we go to Philadelphia. Whatever you need to feel safe." Ruth thought about it, imagined giving birth in the clinic she had built, the place where she had proven herself, the home she had made. "I want to give birth here," she said, "in our clinic, with Mrs. Henderson attending, but I want every possible precaution, every piece of equipment, every backup plan." "Then that is what we will do," Silas promised. The pregnancy progressed normally. Ruth monitored herself obsessively, blood pressure twice daily, weight weekly, fetal heartbeat checked constantly. She read every medical text on obstetric complications, prepared for every possible emergency. Mrs. Henderson watched her with sympathetic concern. "Doctor, Worth, you cannot control everything. Sometimes you have to trust your body." "I am a doctor," Ruth said. "I do not trust, I verify." But as the months passed and the baby grew strong and active, Ruth began to relax, started to believe that maybe possibly she could do this. Until late April of 1890, when labor began. The contractions started at midnight on April 28th. Ruth woke Silas immediately, her medical training overriding panic. "Get Mrs. Henderson," she said, "and prepare the surgical suite just in case." Silas moved with calm efficiency. He had assisted in dozens of animal births, knew the signs of normal labor versus complications. He could see Ruth was frightened, but stable. Mrs. Henderson arrived within the hour, examined Ruth carefully. "Everything looks normal," she said. "Baby is in good position. Contractions are regular. This should be straightforward." But labor was not straightforward. 18 hours in the baby was posterior, face up instead of face down, making descent slower, more painful. Ruth knew the statistics. Posterior presentation increased risk of maternal exhaustion, fetal distress, potential need for intervention. "We need to rotate the baby," she gasped between contractions. "I can try," Mrs. Henderson said. "I will do it," Ruth said. "I know the technique." She talked herself through the internal rotation, medical knowledge overriding pain. Her hands, so steady when treating others, shook slightly as she worked on herself, but it worked. The baby rotated. Descent resumed. 4 hours later, at 2 in the afternoon on April 29th, Ruth gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She held him against her chest, this impossible miracle, and wept with relief and joy and the profound understanding that she had just done the thing she feared most. She had survived childbirth, not because she was lucky, because she was skilled and prepared and refused to let fear win. Silas stood beside the bed, tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," he said wonderingly. "We have a son." Ruth agreed. They named him Samuel Hayes Worth, middle name honoring the mentor who had believed in Ruth when no one else did. Samuel was healthy and loud and perfect. Ruth recovered quickly, her medical knowledge guiding her through postpartum care. And for the first time since Sarah Garrett's death, Ruth felt at peace with childbirth. She had not conquered it, had not eliminated its dangers, but she had faced it and survived and brought new life into the world. That was enough. 6 months after Samuel's birth, a visitor arrived at the clinic. Thomas Garrett, released from prison on compassionate grounds. He was dying. Consumption had ravaged his body, leaving him skeletal and weak. He stood in the clinic doorway, hat in hands, looking nothing like the furious drunk who had led a mob up the mountain. "Dr. Worth," he said quietly, "may I speak with you?" Ruth's first instinct was to refuse. This man had tried to destroy her, had blamed her for his own crimes, had made her life hell. But he was also a dying patient, and Ruth had taken an oath. "Come in," she said. They sat in her private office, Thomas in the chair across from her desk, looking smaller than she remembered, broken. "I came to apologize," he said, "for everything, for blaming you, for the mob, for trying to have you committed. I was wrong. Yes, Ruth said, you were. I spent 4 years in prison thinking about what I did, to Sarah, to you. I was raised to believe a wife was property. That discipline was my right. I never questioned it. He coughed, the sound wet and painful, until I was in prison, powerless, at the mercy of guards who beat me for entertainment. I finally understood what Sarah felt, the fear, the helplessness. Ruth listened without interrupting. I am dying, Thomas continued. 6 months at most. I wanted to make amends before I go, not for forgiveness. I do not deserve that, just to say I was wrong. You were right. About everything. He looked at her directly. I know I have no right to ask, but you are the only doctor within 100 miles. Will you treat me? I have no money, no family, but I do not want to die alone and in pain. Ruth thought about Sarah, about the brutality that had killed her, about the years Ruth had carried false guilt because this man had blamed her instead of accepting responsibility. Every fiber of her being wanted to refuse, to let him suffer as Sarah had suffered. But she was a doctor, and doctors did not choose which patients deserved care. I will treat you, she said. I cannot cure consumption, but I can manage your pain, make you comfortable. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Over the next 4 months, Thomas Garrett lived in a small room at the back of the clinic. Ruth visited him daily, adjusting his laudanum doses, treating his symptoms, keeping him as comfortable as medical science allowed. They talked sometimes about his childhood, his father's violence, how he had learned that love and cruelty were the same thing. Ruth did not forgive him, but she understood him, saw him as a product of broken systems, broken men raising broken sons in an endless cycle. Understanding did not excuse his actions, but it gave context, made him human instead of monster. Thomas died in July of 1890. His last words to Ruth were simple. Thank you for seeing me as human, even when I did not deserve it. Ruth stood at his bedside after he passed, looking at the peaceful expression on his wasted face. Silas found her there an hour later. Are you all right? He asked. I do not know, Ruth admitted. I did the right thing treating him, but I do not know if that makes me strong or weak. It makes you compassionate, Silas said. You separated the person from their actions. You gave mercy without condoning harm. That is not weakness. That is the hardest kind of strength. Ruth leaned against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence. He was still a terrible person, she said. Yes, Silas agreed. But you were a good doctor, and that matters. In August of 1890, a letter arrived from the Women's Medical College, an invitation to present at the National Medical Conference in Philadelphia. Topic: treatment of chronic mastoiditis through foreign body extraction. Ruth read the letter 3 times, hardly believing it. They want me to present Silas's case to 200 doctors. You should do it, Silas said immediately. It means going to Philadelphia, leaving the clinic for 2 weeks. Mrs. Henderson can manage, and I can come with you. We can bring Samuel, make it a family journey. Ruth looked at the invitation again. This was recognition, validation, proof that her work mattered beyond Bitterroot Valley. All right, she said. We go. The conference was held in February of 1891. Ruth stood before 200 physicians, only 3 of them a woman, and presented her findings. She detailed Silas's 18-year history of pain and hearing loss, the 7 misdiagnoses, the beetle larva extraction, the recovery process, the medical implications. Her conclusion was simple but revolutionary. Listen to your patients. Pain is not psychological just because you cannot immediately identify the cause. Absence of obvious pathology does not mean absence of suffering. If a patient tells you they are in pain, believe them. Examine thoroughly, look deeper, save lives. The audience was silent when she finished. Then one doctor in the back began to applaud, then another. Then the entire room rose in standing ovation. Dr. Margaret Hayes sat in the front row, openly crying with pride. After the presentation, young doctors approached Ruth with questions. Patients they had dismissed as hysterical, symptoms they had attributed to imagination. Cases they now wanted to re-examine. One young physician took Ruth's hand. "You may have just saved my patient's life," he said. "I was about to diagnose hysteria. Now I will look again. Actually look." Ruth felt tears sting her eyes. Silas's suffering had meaning. His pain had taught others, had changed medical practice. The conference published her paper in their proceedings. Copies were distributed to medical schools across the country. Ruth Palmer Worth, self-taught midwife from Montana, had changed medicine. They returned to Bitterroot Valley in March. The town gathered at the train station to welcome them home. Not the angry mob from years ago, a genuine celebration. People who respected Ruth's courage, admired Silas's resilience, believed in the healing they provided. Judge Carver was there, frailer than ever, but still standing. "You have made us proud," he said. "Both of you." Mrs. Henderson held baby Samuel, cooing over him. "Town is not the same without you, Dr. Worth. Do not leave us again." Even Sheriff Fletcher approached, looking embarrassed. "I am sorry for the way I treated you years ago. You deserved better." Ruth accepted the apology with grace. Over the next 5 years, the clinic expanded. Ruth trained 3 young women in midwifery and basic medicine. Mortality rates for childbirth dropped to the lowest in Montana Territory. Silas's veterinary practice grew into a teaching facility. He trained 20 students in his methods, published a veterinary textbook that became standard curriculum. Their family grew too. Grace was born in 1892, named for Silas's first wife, honoring her memory while building new joy. Their third child, Henry Carver Worth, followed in 1894, named for the judge whose compassion had given them both a second chance. The women's network Ruth had joined continued its quiet work. 47 women escaped abusive marriages through their help. Ruth kept careful records hidden but documented. In 1896, 8 years after returning to Bitterroot Valley, Ruth stood on the porch of the clinic and looked at what they had built. A hospital, a veterinary college, a community transformed, lives saved and improved through dedication and refusal to accept limitations. Silas came to stand beside her, their children playing in the yard. "Do you ever think about that night?" Ruth asked. "The extraction. Every day," Silas said. "Regret it." He laughed. "Not for a second. That beetle brought you into my life. Everything good started that night." Ruth smiled. "Everything good in mine, too." She looked at the mountains rising beyond the valley, at the sky spreading wide and endless, at the community that had once rejected them and now depended on them. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." "We did," Silas agreed, taking her hand. "Together." That evening, as the sun set over Montana and the clinic lights came on for night patients, as their children laughed and played, as the life they had built hummed with purpose and meaning, Ruth and Silas sat together on the porch. Samuel ran up, asking for a story. "Tell us about the monster in Papa's ear," Grace demanded. Silas smiled. "Again, I tell that story every week." "We like it," Samuel insisted. So Silas began, as he had 100 times before, his voice strong and clear and filled with love. "Once upon a time there was a man who could not hear, and a woman no one would listen to, and together they found a way to make the world pay attention." Ruth listened, holding their youngest child, watching their family, feeling the weight of years and struggles and triumphs settle into something like contentment. They had been sold and dismissed and blamed. They had suffered and fought and refused to break. And in the end, they had built something beautiful, not despite their struggles, but because of them. A family. A practice, a legacy, proof that 2 people the world tried to discard could become indispensable. As the stars came out and the children's voices filled the evening air and Silas's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, Ruth thought about the girl she had been, the one who believed she was worth exactly $50 and no more, That girl would not recognize the woman she had become. Dr. Ruth Palmer Worth, physician, teacher, mother, partner, worth more than any price, worth everything. And finally, after years of doubt and struggle and fighting for every inch of respect, Ruth believed it too. She was enough. She had always been enough. And she was home. The end.